Alrighty, we'll get started, even though there's no word from Launceston on the Discord. I'm sure they'll catch up at some point. Hello, fresh faces, people I haven't seen in 13 weeks. Thanks for coming. This week's lecture, I will go through a quick unit summary and I will talk about the exam a little bit. So I'll go through some exam questions. I won't be giving answers specifically, but I'll be talking and giving some tips. But first, I'd like to introduce you to my new band that I'm starting. We play indie rock music. No, we don't. This is a initiative that a couple of the lecturers here you'll have seen, particularly Joel and Julian and Meredith, Sunja, and a few others have all been wearing these amazing dresses, including myself, for the Do It in a Dress charity. And so we're raising money to try and help educate girls in Africa. I don't know that much about this charity as opposed to some of the other guys, so here's our information. I was told to show you this. I mainly just wanted to wear a dress. Didn't need any charity for me to wear a dress to uni, but did it anyway. So there's a link on the Milo if you want to find out more. But we do have a little team that's just for UTAS. So that's how much we've raised so far in our little team. But there's teams all over the world doing different jobs in a dress. I've already learned that being in a dress is a bit of a pain. Tried to go to the toilet earlier, tried to sit down. All those things really sucked. But it's worth it. So anyway, there's the information. If you'd like to know more, then let me know. Some people are going to come in and take a picture of me halfway through this lecture, so don't be too disturbed by them. Let's begin with just a quick recap of the unit, so the stuff that you've missed. But hopefully you'll go through the lecture recordings and have a look at all of this. I made these slides, these didn't exist, so they're reasonably representative of what we've done in the unit this year. So it's not like I took some slides from last year that explain what we did. I went back and had to think about what we covered specifically and also what I know will be on the exam. So that's not to say that you shouldn't study everything in the unit. I might have actually missed something when I put together these dot points, but you can go into the exam reasonably confident if you cover all of these topics in your study. Clearly the exam won't ask about all of them because there's no room on the exam for that, but this is a pretty good guide of what we've covered, and then I'll go through some exam papers. I'll go through 2017 and 2016 to sort of talk about the style of the questions, but that's going to be about it. So this won't take very long, but here we go anyway. So you might recall the week one, we had no classes, you guys all showed up and your teacher wasn't here. Just a reminder, when you're filling out your evaluates, please don't blame that on me. I had nothing to do with that. The person who didn't show up has subsequently been fired, not for that reason, but for a number of other reasons. So let's say justice has already been served for that one. We don't need to punish anyone any further. Week two then, we showed up, and I did the week one content roughly in terms of just explaining the discipline and what the unit's like. What we found and what is probably scaring you a lot before your exam is that this isn't a black and white answers exam. You're not here to really regurgitate facts, although there'll be one or two questions on the exam where you might be asked to remember what a particular interaction type is, but that's only part of the question. It's then applying that with some relevant example is what will happen on your exam. And so, we found out that it's not a black and white answers kind of unit. There were 4 assignments. You've done 3 of them now. Well done. And the exam is closed book. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but that is still the case. We covered the fact that HCI is very cross-disciplinary in nature, and we've found that through our assignments. We talked about the workplace. We've talked about my research in games, but also with energy conservation. how we can link HCI to a large number of areas, but also academically it has applications in things like AI, cognitive psychology, informing ergonomic design, informing the way that we do graphics design, changing the way that we implement things in computer science, and so on. Also in week 1, we started on chapter 1 of the textbook series from the interaction design book. So chapter 1 was what is interaction design. We didn't cover a lot in week 2 because we only got a couple of slides in, about 6. And so on Milo, I think I've described roughly what slides we got up to. Not that it matters, you just need to know what content we covered, so this is going to be a good guide for that. We looked at elevator controls as a form of HCI, that is a human interacting with a computer that controls a elevator, and we talked a bit about how just even the mapping or the design principles that you use on an elevator panel can greatly impact how people interact with elevators, even though the difference might be a few seconds. That even in our elevators here at UTAS, I always still take probably 1 or 2 seconds extra to work out which button I'm going to press because they're not mapped to the way that the building's laid out. So the metaphor isn't there, and it's not using correct mapping techniques. And so just simple things like that we can improve upon. We also looked at the marble answering machine, and we've come back to this a few times in this unit. This was an example of a prototype, more on that later, but this was an example of being able to interact in a slightly different way through, oh, here we go. They've arrived. Excellent timing. So what are we doing? Do you want to talk about the thing? I've already put a slide up before, but if you guys have anything to say, or... Oh, you guys are taking over this lecture. As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind.
No, we're just here to parade.
Yes. So yeah, I've already mentioned the Do It in a Dress thing, but these guys are collecting some dollars if you're interested in donating.
That's your fashion.
So yeah, are you going to like wander through the crowd or no?
Okay, so who's closed for me? Oh, that's fine.
So this one will be at Chris' office.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so just tell me.
Yep. So this collection box will be in the school office where Chris is. You can donate through there if you like, or you people with your wonderful rustling coins I heard before. Very good. Thanks, guys. Cheers. Nearly forgot that we would be interrupted. I didn't know I had to prepare a pose. Maybe I should get a few more, I don't know. Click the heels together. Okay, so that was fun. Back to the unit summary then. So yeah, we looked at the marble answering machine as a form of a prototype, and we'll talk about prototypes later, but this was a different way of interacting, and we sort of discussed this as a thought experiment. It's not a real product, but we talked about how there's different interactions that we can get from this that we don't get from your usual answering machine, where you've got the little number and you just have an up and down button to try and select things. We can more easily select a specific message by pulling it out. We don't have to go through all of the messages to find the one that we want. We can just directly access it. And we're doing it in a physical way so that we know that the action we're about to perform, which is play the message, is related to that message because the message is represented by a block. So there's a few extra things happening in there. We can use color coding here on the messages so that from a distance we can visually see, mum's called me 3 times and my wife hasn't called me. So it's safe to use my answering machine, for example. So there's things that we can glean from this sort of layout that you can't from just a regular answering machine. In week 3, we talked more about physical affordance. So even though this isn't a human-computer interaction here, we tend to often have a door handle example in this unit. And so this is where objects sort of give hints or reveal how they should be used without you needing to have any extra cognitive load. So ideally, if this door was designed properly, we could look at this without reading it and know that we can pull it. But the problem is, as you know, this door is a push. But the way that this handle is laid out makes it look like it's got this thing that you can grab and pull towards you. And so it's a bad example of physical affordance, because without the word push on it, most people would run at this door. When they're going to this door, they would just instinctively want to pull it towards them. And guarantee every time I go through this door, I have to think, is this one the push or the pull? And then I think about it a bit more, knowing that it's an emergency exit door, and so it's always a push on the way out. But these things can make a big difference. So that was a random example that we had on Milo before we started again on chapter 1. Just introducing the topic still of interaction design. You might have remembered me standing on a chair, subverting the designer of a chair's expectations of what the user experience for a chair is. So you can design for a user experience, so you can design a chair for the experience that someone's going to sit in it and they're going to be comfortable. You can't design that experience, but you can design for that experience to happen by making it, well, chair's a bad example, but you can only design a user experience. You can only design for an experience. You can't design a specific user experience, because people are going to find ways around your design, no matter what. And we also looked, it's not on the slide, and they're therefore consequentially not going to be on the exam, no doubt. We talked about games and emergent gameplay. But you could use emergent gameplay as an example in one of your answers on an exam, no doubt. You can draw upon that. I'd forgotten we talked about it. This lecture also introduced us to different usability goals. So my job today isn't to go through those or list them, but just to let you know that that is where you'll find the main information about them. And user experience goals. And we also listed and explored various design principles. So we talked about visibility in terms of systems showing what actions are available to a user. Feedback to indicate that, trying to provide immediate feedback that once you've pressed a button or once you've done an action, we don't have any delay or worry of the fact that we actually did that action. We find straight away that something was successful or not successful. Otherwise, we're left wondering, thinking that the computer or something is locked up. And so providing feedback to users was a good design principle. Providing constraints, so a common example was disabling items, but also just making it so that parts of the interface are constrained, and reasons why you might do that, such as early on in the experience you don't want to provide all of the functionality because you don't want people to stumble upon parts of your application or artifact that they will find confusing. So you release the constraints slowly over time, perhaps, or just simply when an action doesn't make sense. So in a word processor, it makes sense to change the color of some text, but perhaps it doesn't make sense to do one of the table functions on just a regular piece of text. So you'd grey out or constrain the user from being able to use the table functionality in your word processor. Just thinking of examples on the fly. And then consistency as well between screens, so that people can recognize how to use your interface consistently throughout the experience. We talked about affordances and metaphor. Basically, where we take we draw inspiration from existing things. So examples we used were things like the desktop metaphor that we use. So we immediately know how to use the desktop because we have real-world desktops where we can move things around, and so we expect certain things. We expect to be able to place things on our desktop. We expect to be able to move things into folders. So we have the folder metaphor. We talked about the metaphor breaking down. So in certain cases, things like the recycle bin on a desktop is where the desktop metaphor sort of breaks down, because most people don't have a recycling bin sitting up on their desk, which is what we have on our computer desktops. But it's not the end of the world that happens. It's just an example of metaphors breaking down. We continued in week 3 on to talking about conceptual models and paradigms. So a conceptual model is a high-level description of how a system is organised and how it operates. It's useful to have a conceptual model because it allows us to straighten out our thinking before we start laying out our designs. So if we take a step back and think about how a user is going to conceptually use our model before we start programming or drawing things, then we can reveal problems really early on in the process. So this happens even before prototyping, which again we'll talk about a little bit later on. We covered paradigms. We definitely covered interaction types. So again, these are instructing, conversing, manipulating, and specifically we looked at direct manipulation, where we get immediate feedback while we're doing that manipulation, and exploring. So we covered those a fair bit, and we talked about them consistently throughout the lectures, and as you'll see, these are covered on the exam a fair bit as well. So you'll want to brush up on them. At the same time as talking about interaction types, we talked about the interface types that we can use to bring about this interaction. So these aren't one-to-one things. Remember, we talked about a trick that we might say, oh, a speech interface type is definitely going to use a conversing interaction type. But it's not necessarily the case. We showed that just even typing into Google and changing our responses, that was a conversing interaction type where the computer was adjusting and reacting to our inputs. There was no need for speech, right? It wasn't even a direct conversation necessarily. So don't get fooled into thinking, its interaction type is conversing, therefore we have to use voice recognition or we have to do it in that particular way. So these things are interchangeable with each other. Anything else to say here? Yeah, so I'll say the definitions of the interaction types, even though you should go back and look at them anyway. So I've got here that instructing is issuing commands and selecting options. Conversing is interacting with a system as if having a conversation in some way. So remember, that doesn't say that we're doing speech. It's that we're having some kind of back and forth with the computer in some way. Manipulating, so interacting with objects in a virtual or physical space by manipulating them. So that's your pretty traditional click and drag sort of thing, but just any kind of manipulation. And exploring, so moving through a virtual environment or a physical space. And we used gaming as an example of exploring there. And what we've discussed a lot when talking about interaction types in all the case studies was that they don't always perfectly fit. We often see a combination of them, and sometimes we can't even work out which one of these four is actually suitable for describing a certain case study. And so your answer on an exam might be, when I say what interaction type or types was it, you could say none of these, and here's why. But in that answer, I'm clearly still wanting you to show your knowledge of interaction types when you do that. So say it's a 10-mark question about interaction types and you decide to say, oh, it's nothing, therefore I don't have to describe any of these interaction types. How do I give you 10 marks? So if you're more than welcome to say that it's nothing or that you disagree, or any answer could be correct, but you need to argue your position. And that's where the marks come from with those sort of questions. In week 4, we looked at IBM Watson as a form of the conversing interaction type. So that was just one of the random things we saw on the internet. But I'll point out that these random things we saw on the internet that are on Milo, these could all come up on the exam in some way. And you'll have seen in previous years' exams that stuff like Bubble Popper and stuff like, what's the other one? Joggerbot, things like that. They had full 30-mark questions. So it's up to you to think about how much should we cover some of these, and probably try and predict whether I'm going to give you a 30-mark question on IBM Watson. I'm not, but I could give you a 5-mark one. So you still need to have that knowledge in your brain. And that's where the people who came to every lecture will hopefully do well, and everyone else will need to study hard. In terms of week 4 as well, we continued on with chapter 3. We didn't finish chapter 3, but we returned to it later. But what we looked at the start of chapter 3 was cognitive aspects of human-computer interaction. So we looked at attention, we looked at perception, looked at memory and learning. Specifically, when talking about memory, we looked at recognition versus recall. So we talked a fair bit about that, and it's worthwhile trying to understand the difference between those. We talked about how computers can intervene when it comes to problem solving and planning and reasoning and making decisions to try and reduce the cognitive load on people. So if a computer system can, help people out with their calendar tasks, reminders, things like that, then you can reduce the cognitive load. Week 5, we saw some funnier videos about cognitive tricks. These weren't specifically about human-computer interaction, but we saw some videos that show ways that our minds can be tricked. Yeah, those won't be on the exam, but because they're not about human-computer interaction, but they're a thing. In week 5, we managed to jump ahead. This was to help you with your assignments, because the assignment 2 started talking about personas and scenarios, so we skipped ahead 7 chapters and ignored the ones in between to talk about establishing requirements. And so that's where we talked about personas. Anything to mention here? Not really. We've mostly assessed personas and scenarios in the assignments, but you could be asked to do a persona or a scenario on an exam, or it might be part of your 30-mark answer that you would say, we would write down a persona. Here's an example of one, perhaps. We looked briefly at different forms of data gathering. We looked at this from the perspective of gathering requirements before we start prototyping, so trying to understand the environment. One thing that wasn't clear from these slides, hilariously, but one thing we've looked at, especially in the early weeks of this unit, was we need to think about our users, and we need to think about the context that they're going to use your artifact in. So you might have expert knowledge about the place that you're deploying your HCI artifact in. Generally you won't. You might need other experts, or you might need to gather some data to come up with requirements. So when you were trying to learn about the workplace, you might conduct interviews with people in the target workplace to see what's the problem. You might do focus groups, or you might run questionnaires, have a look at what's already out there. You could do indirect or direct observation, and we saw those little cultural probes as an example, where we had little bags and they came with some instructions and tasks that you'd give to people in that environment. So you might give a little cultural probe to a office worker, and it's a little camera and some steps, and it says, okay, show me pictures of things that you hate about your job. And then you get all this rich data back that's collected in an artistic way rather than a scientific way. We saw examples of gathering data in underwater computing, and we talked about user capabilities as well. So we talked about different dimensions of humans that, depending on what you care about, it might be people's physical attributes, so their size of their hands, their height, their physical strength. These things adjust how you would have to design your physical prototypes, perhaps, or their age or cognitive ability. So if they're a young kid, then you need to have simplified interfaces for them, that sort of thing. So we talked about user capabilities in week 5 as well. In week 6, we started trying to talk a bit more about prototyping. So we looked at an example of a prototype game controller called Marky Marky. And we also looked at an evaluation method of prototyping called Wizard of Oz. And some of you may have done this in your assignment 3, or at least considered it. Wizard of Oz being where we do some evaluation. Perhaps we've got a prototype that's really early stages, and the example we used was that the prototype heavily relies on speech recognition. But you don't want to put proper speech recognition and spend all that money making that work on your lo-fi prototype. So you get your participants to act as if they were using something with speech recognition, but perhaps behind the curtain or behind the one-way mirror, two-way mirror, what do they call them? You've got someone actually listening to what the person said and responding to it, so typing it back out. So using someone behind the curtain to achieve advanced functionality like that, basically for free, except you've got to probably pay that researcher to stand behind the curtain all day. And depending on how you do your evaluation, the person either knows that it's not real speech recognition and that there's someone behind the curtain, or you are trying to deceive them. It depends on what you want to get out of your evaluation. So we talked about Wizard of Oz in that respect, and we showed a Wizard of Oz YouTube clip because that was how we explained why it's called that. I'm sure there's only one mark for explaining why it's called that in the however mark question it might be, if there was one. In week 6, before I disappeared, I talked about prototyping. I showed some slides from Kit 305, 6 or 7, which is the mobile unit. There's a lot of crossover between those slides, and I mainly showed them to talk about party golf prototyping and to not do what we did when it came to prototyping. But it was a nice example, I guess. We talked about in chapter 11 why you might prototype. So justifying or explaining the idea of prototyping, that it's low cost form of evaluation, that it doesn't cost very much to just draw something on a piece of paper or make something out of cardboard, whereas it costs a lot of money to 3D print something or put something through a production line. You can iterate on these fast because if they're low cost, then you can just throw them out and make another one. It allows you to communicate your ideas to other stakeholders or potential end users. It allows you to really quickly and easily make alternative versions. So you could make 3 very similar looking prototypes and get people to tell you which one they thought was the best. We talked about what a prototype can be and the extents of that. So, and you guys all saw in your assignments that this could range from something on a piece of paper through to a PowerPoint presentation, through to an interactive PowerPoint presentation, through to a physical artifact, like some of you made, or it could be a low-level version of the code using an SDK. We talked about storyboarding, somewhat related to scenarios, sort of explaining the process that people might go through using your prototype. We talked about the differences between a hi-fi and a lo-fi prototype, and when you might use one or the other. We talked about vertical slice versus horizontal slice, and the example we used there was a shopping cart application where, a shop interface, basically an online shop, and so maybe the vertical slice prototype doesn't really care too much about finding different products, but instead it shows the entire checkout process all the way to the end. Whereas a horizontal prototype might still just have a checkout button that doesn't do anything, but it shows reasonably well all of the functionality of the online shop. So it shows how to search for items, how to look at thumbnails, how to get more details about an item, how to find different variants of items, stuff like that, but none of it actually functions perhaps. So going broad instead of deep for vertical versus horizontal prototyping. And as I said, we talked about ways that you can prototype, how to prototype. In week 7, I wasn't here, so I probably don't know much about what on earth Meredith talked about. No, I do. So in week 7, Meredith came here and talked to you about the rest of chapter 3. So she talked about mental models in terms of some examples of that. I don't know what example she used, but examples of a mental model that I like to use is that I have a mental model of most traffic light sets that I go at. And the reason I can do that is because most traffic lights follow the same pattern. And I don't know how many of you actually drive, or even just as a pedestrian at traffic lights. When you get a traffic light system that slightly varies, nobody knows how to drive anymore, and I swear it gets worse. Even though someone scientifically has gone, oh, it makes sense for us to do this layout of traffic lights in this order, for whatever reason, it often breaks. I can think of a few examples of that, and then you get more crashes. Because people build up a mental model of how most traffic lights should work from the hundreds of ones that they use, and then they come to this one that's different, and the mental model that's being used for this, or the actual model that's being used for this set of traffic lights, doesn't match your mental model, and things get a little bit less efficient. The example that would have been used in the slides was oven thermostats, and things like, people thinking that they can press the pedestrian crossing button multiple times, more traffic lights, and making that go faster. The layout of keypads on ATM machines is another example that this is sort of more expectations that we expect consistency in the way a keypad layout works, so that you could go to any different ATM machine from different vendors and it is all laid out the same. But if someone decided to lay it out more like a telephone instead or something like that, your mental model of what you expect from an ATM machine suddenly makes you much less efficient at using that system. Week 7 covered the idea of distributed cognition. So this involves trying to represent information in some way, and then the transfer of this between humans to a machine. So how do we transfer information that we've represented and then represented on a machine? But also how do we represent this information human to human with machines in between? Ways of reducing cognitive load were looked at. So we should use computers to try and provide visualizations, try and remind people of things, allow people to annotate things, stuff like that, to take all of the load out of our head, and hopefully, not all of it, but more of the load out of our head, and distribute that to the computer. Week 7 I was away in America. Hope you guys had a party. I did. It was great. So now my timeline's confused. Maybe, I've probably got some of these weeks mixed up, because did I say that was week 7? I was definitely away in week 7. Oh yeah, I just put this in the wrong place, this slide. Right. Meredith also talked to you about social interaction, and so that lecture covered, some introductory stuff on being social and just general face-to-face conversations. But it moved then on to how technology can be used to allow conversations to take place remotely, through telepresence, through co-presence, and shareable technologies. Speaking of communication over the internet, I should check the Discord. And they said, this is a perfect time to use this example. They said, please don't walk away from the desk because you can't see me on the screen. Maybe I'm doing that more than normal because I'm wearing a dress. But I realise that's probably making it so you can't hear me on the mic. So apologies, Launceston. Not doing my remote conversation well. So there you go, I did it again. All right, I'm going to stand right here. So then in week 8 you had study break. Sure you guys studied hard. In week 8 we looked at some examples. We talked about Joggabot, made by the Exertion Games Lab on the mainland. Can't be more specific right now because my brain doesn't work. As well as an example called Spark, which was a nice little video with a guy trying to interact with some drones, basically. Drones that were dressed up as lamps. It was pretty cool. So week 8 we moved on to chapter 12, trying to look at the idea of evaluation to try and get you prepared for your assignment, which would come out the next week. And so broadly talking about evaluation, we thought about why do we want to evaluate, So we want to check, have these requirements that we gathered earlier on, so we talked about that in chapter 10 of gathering requirements. Were we successful in meeting those requirements? And are the users able to use the product, and did they like using it? Things like that. Heaps of other different reasons for why you might evaluate, but they're the main ones. We talked about what you might actually evaluate. So you can evaluate just your conceptual model at the early stages before you've even made a prototype. You show your conceptual model, maybe it's a diagram or something like that, to some people who might use it, get their feelings, get experts' opinions. You might evaluate an early prototype like you guys did for assignment 3, or you might evaluate a more complete prototype or a fully finished project as well. You can still evaluate those, although you probably should have evaluated them before you got all the way through to a complete project. Something that we covered multiple times when talking about evaluation, probably too much, arguably, again, not my slides, were the difference between natural settings and laboratory settings. And we talked a bit about how you might try and make a laboratory setting more natural by introducing things that are realistic to that environment. Our example was, we're trying to emulate a workplace, and we would perhaps bring in distractions. But then when we talked about that, we said, okay, well, we've got to make sure we do that the same for each participant to try and make the data from each participant comparable. But also we can evaluate in the field as well, and we can get more realistic results, but it's hard to control for things. So unless we're there the whole time, even if we are there the whole time, we don't know necessarily what might be influencing the data that you get out. So while natural settings are a useful way of evaluating, you have to accept that your data might get a bit skewed or a little bit freaked out, I guess. Finally, we talked about when you might do evaluation, and in general the answer to that is that you should do it throughout the design. You can do it on finished products as well. In week 8 we also saw some examples of usability labs, so we saw some pictures of those. We saw 2 case studies. There were 3 in the lecture, but we only looked at the first 2. One of how you might evaluate a game versus a human, evaluate people playing a game, but how they felt playing the game versus a computer versus playing against a computer. God, that sentence broke. It's there. Top point 4. It's not as hard as you'd think, but apparently it is. And the other example was studying skiers in the wild, and so in that one it was a little GPS system, and we thought about, you might want to evaluate that in a natural setting, but maybe early on you still want to do some evaluation in a laboratory setting as well. We talked a little bit about some of the factors that might come into play when doing that in a natural setting. Because I don't remember exactly when we started this lecture, I've got this saying week 8 to 9. Doesn't really matter. Timeline doesn't help you guys. It's more, this is everything we covered. It might help you when you're going over the lecture recordings, but whatevs. Chapter 13 looked at an evaluation framework. So this was more on evaluation again, but it was a framework that you could use to either guide your own evaluations, or this framework can also be used to evaluate existing evaluations. That's a weird thing to say. But you could look at someone else's project and see what was their evaluation method using this as well. And so in general, we looked at the steps that you might do, that early on in evaluation you need to work out quite clearly what are the goals. So what do you want to get out of this evaluation? Do you want to test for efficiency, or do you want to test for usability? Do you want to test for enjoyment, that sort of thing? And clearly know what you're actually trying to test. It could be that you're testing multiple things, but in general, what do you want to find out? Do you want to find out if this is improving people's performance, or if it's stopping people from smoking, or is it making them use less energy? What is the goal? Then you turn them into questions that guide what you're doing here. And this sort of crosses over into academia. As we've mentioned, there's a fair bit of blurred line between usability testing for commercial purposes and for research purposes. But the example I gave was my own research questions from my PhD. Hilariously, those questions changed just last week. One of them did, because one of my reviewers disagreed with my research question. I'm angry. It's fine. I only had to change a few things. They still liked it. So it's fine. Then from those questions, you would work out what kind of evaluation methods can you employ to answer those questions. Once you know the evaluation methods, then you can start to dive into what practical issues you foresee. So when you think about maybe you're going to do a Wizard of Oz evaluation with video recording as one of the data collection methods. You'd think about the practical issues of who's going to set up the video recorder, how are you going to store that video data because there's a lot of it, how are you going to get consent for that, although that's related to the next point for ethical issues. You would think about, okay, who's going to tell the person what tasks they have to do, what are the jobs of the person behind the curtain, what things can the prototype do, what things can't the prototype do, which then the person behind the curtain has to do. You know, a million questions of the practical issues. And so you can look at existing methodologies, you can copy other people's methodologies, that's what we do in research, or you can modify it to fit your own needs as well. We talked a bit about ethical issues, like I said, how do you get consent from people, when do you need to get consent? We didn't dive into it too much, but it's definitely something that you need to do when thinking about evaluation. And then finally, analysing and interpreting the data. And then do you make changes to your prototype based upon this? Or what do you do with this? And generally you want to improve upon your prototype. There's some examples as well. These are the ones from the slide, but you know, in my random example of talking about Wizard of Oz with video recording, it's more specific. So on an exam question, it's more likely that you'd talk through a scenario, and then once you've got, an evaluation scenario, and you'd come up with an evaluation method, and then you can be more specific about what your practical issues are. Whereas this slide is just broad of like, how do you select your users? Who does the evaluation? What's the equipment you're going to use? What's the budget? How do you stay on schedule? And so even though it's a closed book exam, if you manage to randomly remember these 5 dot points and then use them, you're not going to get a lot of marks for it. Yeah, 1 or 2 maybe. But the practical issues are dependent on the exact question being asked, the exact evaluation method that you've chosen. So I want to see that you can think about the evaluation, you can think about the specific practical issues yourself. I don't want to see, can you remember stuff in your head? Because if I wanted that, I would just get you to bring in a cheat sheet. When we looked at evaluation, the whole evaluation process, there were some topics covered such as reliability. Reliability / replicability, I don't know if I typoed that or not, can't remember. The idea that is your evaluation valid? So are you measuring what you think you're measuring? Are there any biases? Is the mere fact that you're evaluating someone introducing a bias? What's the scope of it? So can the findings be generalized? Like, have you done something very specific that only works for university students, or have you magically made an experiment that works for the entire population? It's very unlikely the latter would happen. And yeah, ecological validity. So as I was saying, is the mere fact that you are conducting this in a usability lab, or the fact that you're evaluating them influencing or biasing the findings? In week 9, we saw another HCI case study of bubble popper, and we've seen that used on exams in the past. And randomly, I wanted to talk about the Telstra improving their recharge system. Though weirdly, I opened that up on my phone the other day and it was gone, that little shortcut. But the design principle that we saw there was they improved the visibility of some of the functionality, so the ability to use a saved credit card. And then when it was gone, I felt really sad. I feel I've been A/B tested, but I'm not sure. We continued into so chapter 14, and this was more talking about the difference between controlled environments and natural environments. So we started talking more and more about usability testing in a lab, typical tasks that you'd get people to do, what sort of things you might do. So you might observe people, you might time how long it takes them to complete things, you might video record them, you might log what actions they take. We had a bit of a discussion about what we mean by performance and what is an error. Is a thing that you've detected as an error really an error, or is it something else? Or is it just an alternative way of doing a task? And that depends on what you're trying to measure. Getting satisfaction surveys and doing observation in the field versus making the lab realistic, which we talked about a couple of slides ago. There was also the idea of the difference between usability testing and in a commercial sense and just doing experiments for research. And there was a slide in that chapter 14 that talked about the difference between these, that usability testing is more interested in, trying to just improve products. We don't care that much about participant count. The results inform the design. We don't really care that much about replicability and that sort of thing. So it's less academically rigid. But then when we talk about experiments for research, there's minimum numbers of participants that you need in some cases, depending on where you're publishing to, in order to get, in order to get statistical significance, that sort of stuff. We want to try and make sure that we explain all the details of our methodology so that future researchers can build upon it and things like that. So a usability test for my PhD goes for 450 pages, whereas you could do the same thing for commercial purposes without writing a single word on paper. And so here's some examples of a usability lab. And so we can see these researchers on one side of a window here. We didn't get a lot of information about how this is laid out, but it's possible that the people inside can't see out. They've tried to lay out the lab to make it feel like an office environment here. They've given them a desk. They've sort of tried to pretty it up, I guess, not that much. They've got their video recording equipment and some other old-timey things. We had a discussion about screen recording and how this recording device might be able to capture more things than just recording off the screen. If you've got iPhones which can record the screen, but they're not going to record where people's hands were when they're hovering over the screen because it doesn't detect that, whereas this kind of crazy device would record that. Of course, it's going to change the results somewhat because it's not natural to have a big camera poking out of your phone or your PDA or whatever that is. So we discussed those sort of things. We discussed testing conditions, so a little bit about that. We discussed the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, how many participants you might need, and in usability testing that number's quite low, that you might run your test on just 2 or 3 people, and then by the time you run it on a 4th or a 5th person, those 4th or 5th people might not find any new problems with your prototype. And so you'd limit it at 3, iterate on your prototype, and then get more participants. Whereas sometimes, depending on what your research is, you might need a minimum of 20 people to reach statistical significance if you're comparing between multiple groups. We discussed grouping of participants in experimental design, so control versus experiments, where you've got the 2 groups where one group of people doesn't get the intervention, the other group does. Or you might do a pre-post test where you record before and after the intervention. This was definitely starting to dive in towards the idea of HCI for interventions, which you can tell is my area of HCI rather than the other side of things. When you're grouping people in these 2 groups or more than 2 groups, are they different people in each group? Are they the same people in each group? Are they matched? what's the effect, what's the order effect. These are things you might want to discuss in your exam answers when you're talking about evaluation methods. So there might be a question that asks you to come up with an evaluation method, and these are some practical issues that you'd want to discuss. The more the better. In week 10, we started looking at emotional interaction just briefly, and so we discussed the idea of the uncanny valley. We also looked at Pepper as an example of a robot and an interesting way of interacting with computers. The drift table was another example, which was mostly an exploratory kind of design, but we looked at that as well. So we did that under the guise of emotional interaction, which covered expressive and annoying interfaces, Clippy being an excellent example of that, pardon me, but also different forms of error messages and that sort of thing. And briefly we looked at these other points as well. Then we hit week 11, not examinable, we can all go home, have a nap. I tried to introduce some new stuff into the unit, and so this might be a focus of future iterations of the unit, especially if Christy runs this, because her and I both love the behaviour change wheel. So I presented some slides from the serious games unit that modified them reasonably heavily. The behaviour change wheel being a way of designing interventions, not necessarily for technology, but people such as myself have done that before. It's a form of user-centered design, which we've talked about in this unit, with the idea of getting designers to think about behaviour that they want to change, and thinking about the users and then the environment that they're going to that you want them to exhibit the behaviour change in. So if you want them to start exercising more in the workplace, you think about the behaviour of exercise, you think about what sort of limitations or restrictions there are on their capability, opportunity and motivation. So they're physically capable of exercising probably, but maybe they're not motivated to do so. And so going through this step, you would be able to systematically say, we need to fix their motivation. Then comes the extra hard part of doing that. From that, you can come up with behaviour change techniques, and I gave an example of my PhD work, which uses the BCW for a serious game. I forgot I wrote that. Stupid. Yeah. In week 12, we had some other new content. This unit usually does have a guest lecture, so this wasn't relatively new, but the way that we did it was in that it was a Q&A, although Scott mostly talked the whole time because he's amazing. And he was one of the main researchers on exertime, which was relevant to your assignments, but again, not examinable. But if you sort of enjoyed what you were doing here and thinking about that area, I'm sure maybe he would want to talk to you about doing some work with him, because he's a smart guy. Feel free to do that. Now we're here in week 13. Some of you have come to your first lecture. There's a fair bit of material. So, as I said, it's not all going to be on the exam. And so you can try and use past exams as a guide for what selection of that you should study. But in general, that is what we looked at. Have that all in your mind so you can draw upon these examples in your answers. Some questions won't directly ask things like that are dot points on here, but they're things that you can draw upon in your answers. So those practical issues, to really buff out your answer where you're talking about evaluation methods, think about those practical issues and describe them. Write me reams of paper if you like, it's fine. Okay, fine. This was meant to be the last slide of the whole thing, but I haven't done the exam stuff yet, but whatever. I'll point it out now, just because the slide's here. I always talk about this at the end of every unit. Evaluate's super important. I would suspect that this is a pretty important time to give us evaluates for this unit, since it will have a different unit coordinator next year, or at least I could be coordinating it, but effectively brand new as well, because I won't be doing anything that we just did this year. And so your feedback on what you did and didn't like, what we should keep, shouldn't keep, what focuses we should change, will definitely have an impact. They have an impact anyway in other units, but I suspect they'll have a bigger impact than normal for this unit because old unit coordinator's gone bye-bye. So on top of that, I would also like your feedback on my teaching, and so I always mention that there are separate surveys for what the unit is about and what you liked or hated about the unit, but also a separate one for the lecturer, what you liked or hated about me and my teaching style. Those are two separate concepts. And also, I am not your tutor. So if you hated your tutor, don't put bad things on my evaluate because it doesn't make any sense. Or if you love them, then don't give me good marks for stuff I didn't do. I don't know if they will do one. I will do one. Mine's not up yet. Hope I can get it up there. Be honest on these. But they're super important for this unit. They're super important for me because I want to have a job next year, and at the moment I don't. Because that's how they treat the staff here. Cool. So, do people want a 5-minute break before I go into the exam? I'm only going to spend about 15 minutes on the exam, maybe 20. Break or no break? No break? No break. Oh, okay, fine. All right. Well, that just means I'm just going to go really quickly through this then. We'll try. So, the first thing I'll mention, do you guys know your exam timetable? I'm not supposed to say when your exam is. Do people know when the exam is, right? So, assuming that exam time, I won't be at the exam. Sorry. I will be, because I'm in Melbourne. However, I will be contactable. So the exam people will have my mobile phone number, as they're supposed to. So if you have a problem, then get one of the invigilators to literally call me. And I'm going to, at whatever time of day it is, well, I know when it is, but at that time of day, I'll be sitting waiting for a call from people if they have questions about this. So even though I'm not there at the exam, pretend I am and that you can ask the same questions, it's fine, we'll be able to do it. So just because I'm not there, don't feel that you can't ask for clarification. So apologies, I can't do anything about that. So yeah, it's a 2-hour exam, no cheat sheet. That changed in 2016, I think it was, or 2007, I don't know, don't care. But they got rid of the cheat sheet. The justification for this was that other human-computer interaction units at other universities don't do a cheat sheet in very similar content. And the other thing is that the unit coordinator's experience of questions that they got when there was a cheat sheet was that people just wrote exam answers from a previous year and they did really poorly because they didn't actually adjust their answer to the changed question. So we might have an example on this exam here about bubble popper or something like that, but then people wrote about drift table. Even though the sub-questions were the same, the context was completely different. And as you guys know, because I've said it so many times, the context and the users is so important to how we answer these questions. They're what makes these questions not black and white. So if the questions are not black and white, and people bring in a cheat sheet and they just regurgitate old exam answers or regurgitate lecture notes, and we all know how amazing our lecture slides are, then how on earth do we give you marks? So we want you to study and think about the concepts you've learned throughout semester, and then show us, sorry Launceston, show us that you can apply your knowledge to these particular questions. I also suspect it was an excuse to not change the questions that much every year, but that's not why I have kept it like that. So, let me remember. Yep, there's no choice on this exam. You must attempt all questions. Section A is a bunch of shorter 10-mark questions. Section B is 2 larger 30-mark questions, but they have subparts each. It's just that Section B's 2 questions have a theme and somewhat lead on from each other. The other thing I'll mention is spelling and grammar. My approach to marking exams in terms of spelling and grammar is that I don't care that much, as long as I can understand your idea. So certainly you won't lose marks for spelling errors you won't lose marks for grammar, but if your grammar's bad enough that I can't actually get the point of what you're saying, then you'll just inherently lose marks for not being able to communicate your idea. Okay? Yeah. So it's not like one of the other areas like arts or something where we actually care about your writing style or can you spell well or anything like that. It's more about can you just get your idea across in any way, shape or form so that I can understand you. Which is fair. Okay, so section A has some pretty easy, not easy ones, I shouldn't say easy, there's smaller questions. Question 1 here talks about the term user. So this harks back to a blog post from week 2, or in that year it was week 1. And so it would be up to you to try and recall that discussion. So discussions that were had in the lectures and the stuff that we covered in that is examinable material. And so if you were part of that discussion, if you were in the lecture, then you'll do well. It won't be that hard to recall it. But otherwise you're just going to have to try and remember from video recordings. And so with this sort of question though, even if you weren't there, you can still argue a point. You might not be able to get the full marks because you might not have the context of the original discussion. But there's no clear right or wrong answer here. You can agree or disagree with the critics out there that believes that the term user is not a particularly good term, or you can agree or disagree with that basically. But that's not to say that you can just say, oh, I agree, done, 10 marks. I don't even know if that's worth 1 mark. It's entirely around the idea that you can justify your view. So you need to think about what ways do we use the word user? What are the connotations of using it? What are some better terms or alternative terms if you don't think those terms are better? If you think user is great, still mention maybe what other people think are alternative terms. So those are the sort of things you might discuss in that kind of question. And if you agree or disagree with it, you probably want to acknowledge the views of the people who do not like this term. So that part of that would be remembering what was talked about in the original blog post that we saw there. So acknowledging other people's views, looking at both sides basically, that's how you can do that with highlighting the pros and cons. Question 2. This does say name 5 of the 6 usability goals. The term that we're supposed to use when we write exams like this is we either say list or explain because those make sense. Even looking at this exam right now, I don't know whether I would just list them and then describe them. I would just list them because it's saying name them. It's not saying to explain what each of those usability goals are. So that one is remember a dot point list from the slides. But not all the questions will be like that. Any questions about 1 and 2? Sorry, I was meant to pause in between these. Got locked out. See if Launceston has anything to say. No?
I have a question about section A in general.
Yep.
So, like, they're all questions. So, what is a good guide to how long an answer should be for a 10-mark question?
The idea behind this exam is that it's a mark a minute.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's not like we measure it in terms of did you write 10 sentences or something like that. I would expect no more than half a page. A really good answer, if you feel you need to elaborate, would be half a page. But I think that you could get most of the concept out in less than half a page, but around that size, I suspect. Any other questions about that? That's an excellent question. Yeah. For the recording, I think you understood what the question was, but it was asked, what's a rough guide for how long a question answer should be? So this was in the lecture. Question 3, there'll be something like this about interaction types, listing what they are, describing what they are, but also this one, the key word in this sort of question is illustrate. So to illustrate is to provide an example and to provide a good and compelling example and a correct one. So you would talk about examples of each of these interaction types, ones that are pretty distinct. So you can use the examples from the lectures. If you were talking about exploration, you could talk about a game, but just saying, oh yeah, games use an exploration type, interaction type is not enough. You'd need to perhaps provide an example of a game, the sort of things you might do in that game. So there was an example in the lecture, or you can come up with your own. It's totally fine. But the key in this one is trying to illustrate with meaningful examples. And yeah, it actually refers to existing systems here. So saying, yeah, exploration is used in games, what's an existing game system or a game that uses this, and how does it exemplify it? By referring back to the definition of exploration. Any questions about that? Question 4 continues on with the interaction type stuff. So we've harped on and on and on about interaction types a fair bit. Question 4, that's not my notes. Something completely random. Yeah, okay, so question 4 is talking about advantages and disadvantages of the conversing interaction type. So in order to do that, you're probably going to need to come up with some examples. Think about artifacts that might use a conversing interaction type. So if they do require you to speak out loud, then a disadvantage is that you can't use it in loud environments. But if that was your only example, then you probably wouldn't do very well, because it's showing that you think that conversing is only about speech recognition or something like that. You might talk about disadvantages of conversing in terms of it can be costly to make a computer interact in this way. And then you'd refer to IBM Watson as a way that's starting to make that somewhat affordable. But the complexities and cost of AI to support conversing is a pretty big disadvantage. The advantages are reasonably straightforward. You could talk about them using my Google example and stuff like that. Okay. So you need to think about all facets of each of these interaction types, because you might be posed a question similar to this. We didn't look a huge amount at direct manipulation, but this question here would get you to think about what it means to do direct manipulation. And so you'd refer to the idea that you get immediate feedback. You'd talk about how it differs to regular manipulation and stuff like that. Wizard of Oz here, so explaining probably the process of how you do it, but then this is an example of how questions will not just say, okay, regurgitate what Wizard of Oz is from a definition standpoint. How would you use Wizard of Oz for X? And in this exam, they referred to the non-functional prototype of the answering machine. So what are some things that you might get the person behind the curtain to do? And why might you do it, perhaps? What are the advantages of doing it is when you start to really hit the full marks for this question. Specifically when it starts to say things like discuss, that's a prime time to start talking about advantages and disadvantages, even if you weren't asked specifically, if you can think of them. Any questions about section A? I'll be looking at 2016 as well, at some random examples from there. Okay, so section B, anything else I just forgot? Nope. Section B would start to see some more case study sort of stuff. So particularly question 7, you can expect a sort of case study, and because there's so many marks associated with this though, where, we don't want to penalise you to the point where you forgot to study for Joggerbot and then you're blocked out from getting 30 marks on the exam entirely. So we provide you with a bit of a refresher, so you can rely on the fact that you'll get 2 basic paragraphs, I guess, or 1 paragraph explaining the system. but it might be something that we've used before, so that you have even more context about it. And so this question at first just gives you all the context and then asks you to describe a conceptual model. We didn't talk that much about conceptual models, so it's unlikely that I'll ask specifically that. But you'd be more likely to get things like part B here, where you need to take this case study and analyse it in terms of the interaction types. So we did this in the lecture. We talked about the different interaction types in Joggabot. We talked about it for a lot of other examples. So if you can recall those discussions, then that'll help you. But otherwise, you just have to do it on the exam. And part C here, which was the same question for question 7A in 2016, is talking about a meaningful test scenario. And I'll just highlight the wording we've used here. It says test scenario. This scenario isn't the same scenario as what we talked about with personas and scenarios. This is a test scenario. The other one's just a scenario where we're describing a narrative of a persona using a system. A test scenario, I really wish that I'd caught this when I changed the exam this year, is where you would talk about the evaluation types, what are the practical issues, what data would you collect, how would you collect it, and justify some of those. So a scenario being, what are all the things you would do to test this? Not the other kind of scenario. And I apologise for keeping that word in there. But yeah, you could expect a question like that says, okay, given this product or this artifact, how would you evaluate it? It's a super mini version of assignment 3. And 10 marks. Any questions about that? So little questions. Oh. So you don't know what you don't know, I guess. So question 8 is usually going to be around the idea of usability testing in some way. So this one just asks you to describe a typical setup of a usability lab. So you would recall certain things that you would have in your lab to record data. So whether or not you're using them all at the same time, but maybe you would talk about the fact that your usability lab might include a video recorder, might include a computer itself that has a keylogger on it. The room might be split in two with a mirror or not a mirror, things like that. And describe how that would actually help you do testing would be a really good way of framing this answer. Rather than just listing those things, to be able to hit the 100% marks of this question, I would be describing why those are there. Maybe I am expecting too much, who knows. These last few here are then taking usability testing but doing it in an example. So in this case it's asking about office software and it's asking you to put yourself in the shoes of being asked to evaluate some office software but in a usability lab as opposed to in the field. So you would talk about some of the things that could impact the results of the study. So the fact that it's not a realistic environment, they're not in the office that they work in 9 to 5, they've come to your office. And maybe you'd start talking about some of the things that you could do to make things more realistic for them. But yeah, you're basically saying what are the biases, what are the things that impact our evaluation here. So again, it's some of the practical issues, I guess. And then finally, question 8C gets you to, again, imagine that you've been asked to test a mobile navigation device for underwater caves. So this does refer to an example that we had in the slides, but it might not be. We might throw something from left field at you here. And so it asks you, should you test this in a usability lab? We've already discussed the answer to that. I feel like if I talk more about this, I'm just going to give you the answer to this one. But the idea is that in in theory, there's multiple ways you could answer this, which is why we say justify your answer. Tell me why you're right, and you can get some marks. Any questions about 2017 exam? Beauty. All right, so we'll really quickly look at 2016. So 2017 is on Milo. This one's also on Milo, but via the library site. So the same layout of section A having 6 questions, and you can see that some questions are reused. How much have they been reused here? Let's check. Even if something appears to be reused, you might want to, you should double check questions by reading them carefully to make sure that they're not, that they have actually changed or not. Be super careful of that. Because otherwise, if you regurgitate an answer from a previous exam because you didn't check that the question changed or not, then you're going to have a bad time. But for our purposes today, that's the same. This one's the same. So here's an example of a section A thing, possibly talking about one of the case studies that we had in class, and this one's just specifically saying, talk about interaction types for this example. This one's a pretty mean one. As we discussed in the lecture, it was reasonably hard to come up with interaction types for this. And so another thing, of course, when looking at past exams, there'll be stuff that we didn't cover. There was an Olympic messaging system case study in a previous year. We didn't cover that this year. Clearly not going to ask you that. Wizard of Oz made it in. This one here takes something from the slides, and this was our example of an ice hockey game evaluation. So talking about how people felt about playing against a computer versus playing against a friend, and it's asking you to try and interpret these results. That's pretty hard with this question because they don't give us a lot of context. What are the units here? What's the standard deviation? We didn't really... You could ignore this column if you were answering this one because we didn't tell you what a standard deviation is, but in general you probably know what a mean is, so you're able to compare these. You might be able to guess that this was a Likert scale survey, but we don't know that for sure. So if you were answering this horribly worded question, which I hate, you would state what your assumptions are in this one. I really hate this question. God. But yeah, you'd be able to suggest maybe people found playing against a computer more boring than playing against a friend. But to really fully answer this question, you would say, okay, you'd have to test for statistical significance. There's a lot of other variables here of how many people did they check here, what was the order effect or anything like that. Did they get people to play against a friend first, then against a computer? So did they learn how to play the game and get better at it? That sort of thing. Let's see, question 7. Again, it talked about Joggerbot, so it used that case study example. We got our description of the system, but we had a different set of questions. So, well, slightly different. This is the same as 2017's one, where we said, how would you evaluate Joggerbot? It's a pretty standard question, that one. But what sections B and C talk about are what are the quantitative and qualitative pieces of data that you could collect. So your evaluation scenario up here might not collect quantitative and qualitative data. So for these two, you would just say, okay, in another evaluation scenario, we could collect this qualitative data. So you might survey people about how did they feel that they were more motivated to run with Joggerbot, or you might check how far did they run for, how long did they run for, did their heart rate go up or down, things like that. So you talk about what kind of data you could collect, and then, boom, interaction types, our favourite. Question 8, has usability lab question in it. This one talks about scuba diving, but it's the same sort of question of, would you test this in a usability lab? Would you test it in the real world? Would you do both? Would you do them at what times? Stuff like that. And finally, this question's the same as well. not exactly the same, but it would say, yes, there's an example. I would have been tricked by this. The last sentence of this is different. What should you do to ensure that the results of the usability study are realistic, as opposed to why would you be cautious? So that the last sentence is different. There's an example. Be careful, because I would have got tricked. So this is just asking for a more specific answer, which we've talked about multiple times. Okay, that's it. Any questions about these exams? Study hard. I've already talked to you about the evaluates, so yeah, please do them. That'd be great. If you are the sort of person who might forget to do them after your exam, maybe do them early, but then you won't be able to complain about the exam on them. So, thanks. That's it. It's been fun. Cheers. Bye.
Yes. So we just have to follow all this content in the chapter, right? But there are lots of examples, a lot of links in my notes.
You should still go through all of them, but this was a summary. So what I said was that it's a good guide of what we've covered, and so, you know, hopefully most of the exam questions are going to be on those topics, but you should study everything anyway. But this is the best guide. Okay.
Okay, so still everything, still all the links in my notes.
Yeah, so you're going to want to look in at those case studies. Yeah, but you know the ones that I've listed is good. Yeah, so you can run with them. Yeah.
So, right, thank you.
Yeah.